Robert was just a clerk until he found a secret that could end the world. Now the government wants him dead, and his only weapon is a stolen file. Would you run or would you fight? The year was 1948, and London was a city of long shadows and ration cards. Arthur Penhaligon, a 55-year-old veteran of the Great War and a high-ranking clerk in the Ministry of Supply, sat in his cramped office overlooking the Thames. The fog outside was thick, smelling of coal smoke and river silt. Arthur was a man of meticulous habits. His life was measured in ink and carbon paper, but today the routine was shattered. On his desk lay a file that shouldn't exist. It was a requisition order for high-grade cobalt and industrial diamonds, signed by a man Arthur knew had died in a bombing raid 3 years prior. The destination for the materials was a shuttered steel mill in the north, a place that had officially been decommissioned after the Blitz. Arthur's dilemma was quiet but lethal. If he reported the discrepancy, he risked exposing a black market operation that likely involved his own superiors, men he had served within the trenches. If he stayed silent, he was complicit in the theft of resources vital to the rebuilding of a broken nation. He thought of his wife, Margaret, who was finally recovering from a long illness. Their stability depended on his pension. At his age, a scandal would not just end his career, it would erase their future. He picked up his fountain pen, the nib hovering over the approve line. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the distant chime of Big Ben. Arthur realized that the war might have ended in the headlines, but in the dark corridors of power, a new, more treacherous conflict was just beginning. While Arthur wrestled with shadows in London, a young woman named Clara Vance was boarding a midnight train at Berlin's Anhalter station. Clara, 32, was a translator for the Allied Commission, or so her papers claimed. In reality, she was a courier for a loose network of scientists trying to prevent nuclear secrets from falling into the wrong hands. In her coat pocket was a microfilm canister containing the blueprints for a specialized cooling system. She had been told the recipient was a British official named Penhaligon. Clara was a widow. Her husband had been a physicist who disappeared in the final days of the war. She did this work not for ideology, but for a desperate hope that someone somewhere still held the pieces of the world together. As the train jolted forward, a man in a heavy wool coat sat across from her. His eyes were sharp, scanning her with a predatory curiosity. He introduced himself as Julian Thorne, a trader in antiquities. Clara felt the cold weight of the canister against her hip. If she handed the film to the wrong man, it wouldn't just be her life at stake, it would be the balance of global power. She had to decide, was Thorne a contact or a hunter? The train screamed through the dark German countryside, and Clara realized that in the new world, everyone was a stranger. She gripped her handbag, wondering if the man across from her could hear the frantic beating of her heart. Every stop on the line was a potential trap, and the border was still hundreds of miles away. In the industrial heart of Sheffield, a foreman named Silas Reed stood before the rusted gates of the Blackwood steel mill. Silas was 60, a man with soot in his lungs and iron in his blood. He had been called back to work by a private contractor, a man named Sterling, who promised him double wages to oversee a special project. Inside the mill, Silas found equipment that didn't belong in a steel plant. There were high-precision centrifuges and lead-lined vats. He wasn't smelting girders, he was refining something far more dangerous. Silas was no scientist, but he knew enough to recognize the signs of radiation, the metallic taste in the air, the strange glow in the cooling tanks at night. Silas's moral conflict was visceral. His community was starving, and the mill provided jobs for 50 men who had nothing. If he blew the whistle, the mill would be shut down by the military, and 50 families would go hungry. But if he continued, he was poisoning his own men and building a weapon he didn't understand. Sterling approached him, patting him on the shoulder. "We're making history, Silas," he said, handing him a bonus envelope. Silas felt the thickness of the cash. He thought of his grandson, who needed a warm coat for the winter. He looked at the smoking chimneys and wondered if the price of bread was worth the cost of the soul. He realized that the factory wasn't just producing metal, it was manufacturing a future he was beginning to fear. The quiet of Arthur Penhaligon's London office was broken by a sharp knock. Enter Inspector Thomas Vance, a man with the weary face of a bloodhound and a coat that smelled of cheap tobacco. Vance wasn't from the local constabulary. He was special branch. He sat across from Arthur, placing a grainy photograph on the desk. It showed the very same steel mill in Sheffield that had been haunting Arthur's thoughts. "We're looking for a leak, Arthur," Vance said, his voice a low gravel. "Someone is diverting strategic materials under the guise of reconstruction. Cobalt, diamonds, things that build engines or reactors." Arthur felt his collar tighten. He knew that if he mentioned the requisition order now, he would be admitting he had sat on the information for 48 hours. To the inspector, that silence looked like treason. Arthur faced a paralyzing choice. He could hand over the file and hope Vance believed his story of clerical oversight, or he could burn it tonight and pray the trail ended elsewhere. If he spoke, he might expose a conspiracy, but he would certainly destroy his own career and leave Margaret destitute. Vance watched him, his eyes lingering on Arthur's trembling hands. The inspector knew that men like Arthur didn't break laws for greed, they broke them out of fear. Arthur realized that he was no longer just a clerk. He was a witness in a trial that hadn't even started yet. He had to decide if he was a servant of the crown or a servant of his own survival. The train slowed as it approached the border of the British zone in Germany. Clara Vance watched through the fogged glass as soldiers with dogs patrolled the tracks. Julian Thorne, the antiquities trader sitting across from her, hadn't moved. He was reading a newspaper, but he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. Clara's hand stayed inside her handbag, fingers brushing the cold metal of the microfilm canister. Suddenly, the carriage door slid open. A Soviet officer entered, flanked by 2 armed guards. They were looking for stolen industrial assets. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. If they searched her, the film would be found in seconds. Before she could react, Thorne leaned forward and grabbed her hand, pulling her close. "Keep your mouth shut and look annoyed," he whispered. He then produced a set of high-level diplomatic papers from the Ministry of Supply, signed by an Arthur Penhaligon. The Soviet officer glanced at the papers, then at the couple. After a tense silence, he grunted and moved to the next cabin. Thorne didn't let go of Clara's hand. "You're carrying the cooling blueprints, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the clatter of the tracks. Clara realized that Thorne wasn't a hunter, but he wasn't a friend either. He was a broker. He told her that he could get her to London safely, but only if the film was delivered to his associates first. Clara had to decide, trust a man who lied for a living or risk the Soviet gulag. She realized that in 1948, the truth was a currency she couldn't afford. Back in Sheffield, the air inside the Blackwood mill was thick with an ozone-like tang. Silas Reed watched as the specialists prepared for a midnight pour. These weren't local men. They spoke with heavy accents and moved with military precision. Sterling, the contractor, stood on the observation deck, checking his pocket watch. Silas had discovered something earlier that evening. The steel they were producing was actually casings for high-density storage, and the cobalt he was requisitioning was being used to stabilize a radioactive core. One of the younger workers, a boy named Leo, had collapsed an hour ago, his nose bleeding uncontrollably. Sterling had ordered the boy to be taken to a private clinic instead of the local hospital. Silas knew that clinic was a lie. If he let this continue, Leo would be the first of many. But if Silas shut down the furnace now, the thermal shock would destroy the equipment, revealing the illegal operation to the entire city, and likely resulting in his own accidental death. Silas gripped the manual override lever. To his left were the men he had worked with for 40 years, men who needed their wages to survive the winter. To his right was the truth of what they were building, a nightmare in a lead-lined box. He looked up at Sterling, who was smiling at him. Silas realized that the industrial age had given way to something far more sinister. He had to decide if he was a foreman or a guardian. As the molten metal began to flow, Silas felt the heat of the fire against his skin, mirroring the burning of his conscience. Inspector Vance did not leave Arthur's office. Instead, he locked the door and pulled a chair closer, the smell of his tobacco now cloying in the small room. "Arthur," he began, "we found a courier in Berlin, a woman named Clara. She was carrying papers with your signature." Arthur's heart skipped. He hadn't signed anything for a courier in years. He realized someone had been forging his hand to move secrets across the Iron Curtain. Vance leaned in, his voice a whisper. "The ministry is compromised. If I take this to the board, you'll be the scapegoat. They'll say you were the architect of the whole smuggling ring." Arthur looked at the photo of his wife on the desk. He was a small man caught in a giant's game. Vance offered him a way out. Arthur could act as a double agent. He would continue to approve the requisitions, but he would report every destination to Vance privately. This was a trap within a trap. If Arthur agreed, he was committing treason against his own department to serve a shadowy branch of intelligence. If he refused, he was a criminal by morning. He realized that the ministry wasn't just a place of records anymore. It was a front for a shadow government. He thought of Margaret's medical bills and the quiet life they had built. To save his future, he had to become the very thing he feared, a ghost in the machine. He nodded slowly, the ink on his fingers feeling like a permanent stain on his soul. Clara and Julian Thorne arrived at a nondescript townhouse in London's East End. The windows were boarded up, and the air inside tasted of damp and old newsprint. Julian took the microfilm from Clara, but he didn't hand it to any associates. Instead, he placed it on a table and drew a pistol. "I'm not a broker, Clara," he said, his voice cold. "I'm a survivor. This film is my ticket out of a world that's about to burn." Julian explained the truth. The cooling blueprints weren't for a reactor, but for a new type of cobalt bomb, a weapon designed to salt the earth and leave it uninhabitable for decades. The men in Sheffield were building the prototype. Clara felt a wave of horror. Her husband had died trying to stop this, not help it. Julian offered her a choice: join him in selling the film to the highest bidder, a neutral party in the West, or stay here and wait for the ministry's cleaners to arrive. Clara looked at the man she had almost trusted. If she killed him and took the film, she could try to find Arthur Penhaligon, the only name she knew. But Julian was a trained operative, and she was just a translator with a broken heart. She realized that her husband's legacy wasn't a blueprint, but a warning. She had to decide if she would become a thief to save the world, or a martyr for a secret that was already leaking out. The sound of a car stopping outside made her blood run cold. Silas Reed didn't pull the lever, but he didn't stay silent either. He had smuggled the young worker, Leo, out of the mill in the back of a coal truck. Now, Silas stood in a rainy alleyway meeting a man he had known since childhood, a local reporter named Miller. Silas showed him a small, stolen vial of the heavy water used in the cooling tanks. "They're building something that'll kill us all, Miller," Silas wheezed. Miller looked at the vial with terror. "If I print this, Silas, the military will shut down the whole city. Martial law, they'll say we're Soviet agents." Silas knew the risk. He had lived through 2 wars and seen what security did to freedom. If the story broke, the mill workers would lose their jobs, and Silas would likely face a firing squad for violating the Official Secrets Act. But if he didn't speak, the midnight pours would continue until the soil of Sheffield was poisoned forever. Suddenly, a black sedan pulled into the alley. Sterling's men stepped out, their silhouettes sharp against the wet pavement. They weren't there to talk. Silas shoved the vial into Miller's hand. "Run," he barked. He stood his ground, a 60-year-old foreman with nothing but a pipe wrench and a lifetime of regret. He realized that his work at the mill was over. The furnace was hot, but the cold realization that he was expendable was far more intense. He had to decide how he wanted to die, as a silent employee or a loud traitor. Arthur Penhaligon spent the night in the ministry archives, his eyes burning under the flickering fluorescent lights. Following Inspector Vance's instructions, he had begun tracing the forged signatures. What he found was more terrifying than a foreign spy ring. The forgeries weren't coming from outside, but from the office of the minister himself. The British government wasn't just losing secrets. It was secretly funding the Sheffield project to build a deterrent without Parliament's knowledge. Arthur sat back, his hands ink-stained and trembling. He held the smoking gun, a direct memo linking the minister to Stirling and the Blackwood Mill. Suddenly the archive door creaked. It wasn't Vance. It was the minister's personal secretary, a young man with a hollow smile. "Working late, Arthur. The minister appreciates your dedication to the special accounts." Arthur realized Vance might have set him up to find this, or worse, Vance was part of it. If Arthur handed the memo to Vance, he might be giving the wolf the keys to the sheepfold. If he kept it, he was a dead man. He tucked the memo into his sock, a primitive act of defiance for a man of paper. He had to decide if he would play the loyal clerk one last time, or if he would burn the entire ministry down with a single piece of evidence. He realized that in a world of lies, the only thing more dangerous than a secret was the truth. In the East End safe house, the standoff between Clara and Julian Thorne was interrupted by a hail of gunfire. The cleaners had arrived, but they weren't ministry men. They were mercenaries hired by the conglomerate behind Stirling. Julian shoved Clara under a heavy oak table as the windows shattered. "Change of plans," he yelled over the roar of a submachine gun. "The broker I work for just got liquidated." "We're on our own." Clara watched as Julian returned fire, his professional mask slipping to reveal raw desperation. In the chaos, the microfilm canister rolled across the floor, settling near an open floor vent. Julian reached for it, but a bullet grazed his shoulder, pinning him behind a sofa. "Get it, Clara. If they get that film, Sheffield becomes ground zero for a test run." Clara crawled toward the canister. She could grab it and run out the back door, leaving Julian to his fate, or she could help him and risk being caught in the crossfire. She realized Julian was right. The film wasn't just a ticket, it was a trigger. She reached the canister just as the front door was kicked in. She had to decide in a heartbeat, be a survivor like Julian or a protector like her husband. She gripped the cold metal and looked for a way out through the smoke, knowing that every second she delayed was a second closer to a nuclear dawn. In the Sheffield alleyway, Silas Reed stood his ground as Stirling's men approached. He expected a beating or a bullet, but instead, the black sedan's rear window rolled down. Stirling himself looked out, his face illuminated by a gold lighter. "Silas, you're a hero of the working class," Stirling said smoothly. "Don't ruin it over a vial of water." Miller won't make it to the newspaper office. We own the press and we own the police. Sterling offered Silas a final bargain: return the vial, sign a statement saying Miller was a Soviet provocateur, and the boy Leo would be given the best medical care money could buy. If Silas refused, Leo would disappear, and Silas's family would be evicted by morning. Silas looked at his calloused hands. He had spent his life building things: bridges, tanks, homes. Now he was being asked to build a lie. He looked at Miller, who was trembling beside him. Silas knew that the truth was a fragile thing, easily crushed by men with sedans and gold lighters. But he also knew that if he yielded now, the poison in the mill would eventually reach everyone he loved. He tightened his grip on his wrench. "The water stays with the press, Sterling," he growled. He swung the wrench not at the men but at the sedan's headlight, a signal of war. He realized that a foreman's job was to manage the fire, and tonight he was going to let it burn. Arthur Penhaligon took the first train to Sheffield, the minister's memo still burning a hole in his sock. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. Following a lead in Vance's notes, he went to a small pub near the train station. There, in a corner booth, sat a woman with haunted eyes and a man with a bandaged shoulder. It was Clara and Julian. They looked at the aging clerk with suspicion, but when Arthur produced the ministry's requisition file, the air in the room changed. Clara laid the microfilm on the table. "The cooling blueprints," she whispered. Arthur's hands shook as he realized the scale of the horror. The British government wasn't just building a bomb. They were building one that didn't work properly. The cooling system was flawed. If Sterling ignited the prototype in the mill, it wouldn't be a controlled test. It would be a meltdown that would level the city. Julian Thorne leaned in, his pistol hidden under a newspaper. "Vance is coming, Arthur, and he's not coming to help. He's the one who hired the mercenaries to kill us in the safe house." Arthur realized the inspector was the cleaner for the minister. They had the evidence, the blueprints, and the motive, but they were three people against an empire. They had to decide: flee to the coast and try to alert the Americans, or head into the heart of the fire, the Blackwood Mill. Arthur looked at Clara and saw a courage he hadn't felt in decades. He realized that a clerk's final duty was to close the accounts, no matter the cost. The trio arrived at the outskirts of the Blackwood Mill just as the sun began to set through a layer of thick, yellow smog. Silas Reed was already there, barricaded inside the foreman's office with a small group of loyal workers. The police had cordoned off the area, but they weren't moving in yet. They were waiting for Sterling's orders. Silas saw Arthur, Clara, and Julian approaching through the rear scrap yard and pulled them inside. "The furnace is at critical," Silas warned, his voice a rasping wheeze. Sterling's men locked the cooling vents from the observation deck. They're planning to trigger a minor accident to justify a total military takeover of the region. Silas showed them the vats of cobalt. The heat was becoming unbearable. The air tasted like scorched copper. Arthur looked at the memo and the blueprints. If they could get to the main terminal, they could override the lock, but someone had to physically hold the vent lever in the high radiation zone. It was a suicide mission. Silas stepped forward, but Julian held him back. "You've done enough, old man," Julian said, but Clara shook her head. She knew the blueprints better than anyone. It's not just about force. It's about precision. They stood in the center of the crumbling mill, four strangers tied together by a secret. They had to decide who would stay and who would run to tell the story. Silas looked at the furnace and realized his life had been leading to this single moment of heat. Inspector Vance arrived at the mill gates, but he wasn't alone. He had a platoon of military police with him. Through the megaphone, his voice boomed: "Arthur Penhaligon, you are under arrest for high treason. Come out now and turn over the documents." Inside, the temperature was rising to lethal levels. Arthur sat at the foreman's desk, frantically typing a telegram to the BBC using the mill's emergency line. It was a race against time. Clara and Silas climbed the gantry toward the cooling vents. The radiation was invisible, but it felt like 1,000 needles pricking their skin. Julian stayed at the door with his pistol, ready to hold off the first wave of guards. "Go," Julian shouted. "If that telegram doesn't go through, none of this matters." Arthur's fingers flew over the keys. He was transmitting the minister's memo, word for word. On the gantry, Silas reached the lever. It was glowing a dull red. He looked at Clara and pushed her back toward the lead-shielded staircase. "Tell them what happened here," Silas said. He grabbed the lever with his bare hands, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. He felt the coolant begin to flow, a roar of steam drowning out the sound of the approaching sirens. Arthur hit the send key just as the office door was kicked open. He looked up into Vance's cold eyes and smiled. He had finally balanced the books. Inside the foreman's office, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy thud of military boots. Inspector Vance stood over Arthur, his service revolver aimed at the clerk's chest. The telegram machine had fallen silent, the final stop printed on the ribbon. Vance looked at the machine, then at Arthur. You think a few words over a wire can stop the ministry, Arthur? We own the airwaves. That message will never reach the printers. But Arthur, surprisingly calm, leaned back. I didn't send it to the BBC, Inspector. I sent it to the International Press Corps at the London docks. They're boarding a ship for New York in 20 minutes. By the time your men reach them, the truth will be halfway across the Atlantic. Arthur's gamble was absolute. He had bypassed the state-controlled channels, betting on the hunger of foreign journalists. Vance's face contorted with a mixture of rage and realization. He knew he had failed. He had two choices: execute Arthur now and face a public inquiry he couldn't control, or try to bargain for the return of the minister's memo. Arthur looked at the photo of Margaret in his pocket. He realized that for the first time in his career he held the power. He wasn't just a clerk, he was the ghost that would haunt the minister's legacy forever. He looked at Vance and said, "The price of my silence just went up, Inspector. I want the men in this mill protected." High above the furnace, the roar of the coolant was deafening. Silas Reed still held the lever, his body acting as a human bridge to keep the vents open. Clara watched from the shielded staircase, her heart breaking. The radiation was taking its toll. Silas's breathing was a ragged, wet sound. "Go, girl," he choked out. "The pressure is dropping. The core is stabilizing. Get Julian and get out." Clara hesitated. She had the microfilm blueprints in her bag, the only physical proof of the bomb's flawed design. If she stayed to help Silas, they would both be captured or killed by the advancing soldiers. If she left, she would be abandoning the man who had just saved the city. She looked at the gantry. Julian was already at the base, waving her down, his pistol empty. The military police were breaching the scrap yard. Clara made a heartbreaking decision. She blew a kiss to the old foreman, a man who had become a father to her in a single hour of fire. She turned and ran down the service ladder. Silas watched her go, a faint smile on his soot-stained face. He felt the cold water finally dousing the heat of the core. He had prevented the disaster, not with a scientist's brain, but with a foreman's hands. As the soldiers reached the observation deck, Silas let go of the lever and collapsed into the shadows of the mill he had served his entire life. Clara and Julian Thorne fled through the dense, soot-heavy woods surrounding the Sheffield outskirts. Behind them, the Blackwood mill was bathed in the harsh glare of searchlights. They could hear the barking of dogs and the shouting of orders. They were fugitives now, carrying a secret that made them the most hunted people in Europe. Julian's shoulder was bleeding through his bandage, and Clara's legs felt like lead. "We can't go to the authorities," Julian whispered as they hunkered down in a hollow beneath an ancient oak. "Vance will have every port and station covered. Our only hope is the network Clara's husband belonged to." Julian looked at Clara. He wasn't a broker anymore. He was a man who had seen the end of the world and decided he didn't want to be part of it. He offered Clara a choice. They could split up, increasing the chances that one of them would survive with the film or stay together and face the odds. Clara looked at the microfilm. She realized that her husband hadn't just been a scientist, he had been a man of conscience. She couldn't let his work or Silas's sacrifice be in vain. "We stay together," she said firmly. She knew that as long as they had the blueprints, they were a threat to the Shadow government. They began to walk toward the coast, guided only by the stars and the desperate hope that the telegram Arthur had sent was already changing the world. They were moving through a forest of shadows, but for the first time, they weren't afraid of the dark. London awoke to a scandal that shook the very foundations of the Parliament. Arthur's telegram had reached the American press, and by noon, the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post were screaming about Britain's secret cobalt suicide. The Minister of Supply, trapped by the paper trail Arthur had left behind, faced a barrage of questions he couldn't answer. The special accounts were frozen, and an emergency session of the House of Commons was called. Inside the ministry, Arthur Penhaligon was no longer being interrogated. Instead, he was being ignored. The power had shifted so rapidly that his former superiors were too busy burning their own files to worry about a 62-year-old clerk. Inspector Vance had disappeared, his special branch credentials revoked. Arthur walked out of the ministry for the last time, his briefcase empty. He sat on a bench by the Thames, watching the tide go out. He knew his career was over and his pension was likely gone, but he felt a profound sense of peace. He had done the one thing a clerk is never supposed to do. He had disrupted the order to save the people. He thought of Silas, whose body was still being held in Sheffield, and Clara, who was still a ghost in the wind. He realized that legacy isn't built in stone or steel, but in the courage to say no when everyone else is saying yes. He stood up and began the long walk home to Margaret, ready to face a future that was uncertain but finally honest. Months later, a small package arrived at a quiet cottage on the coast of France. Inside was a single, developed photograph of a blueprint and a letter signed simply C. Clara and Julian had made it across the channel, aided by the scientific network that had finally come out of the shadows. The microfilm had been turned over to an international commission, ensuring that the flawed cobalt bomb design would never be built by any nation. The Blackwood Mill was now a memorial site, its furnaces cold and its chimneys silent. The Cobalt Shadow had passed, but it left behind a world that was more cautious, more aware of the invisible poisons of power. Silas Reed was buried as a local hero, his family's future secured by a public fund started by the very workers he had saved. In London, Arthur Penhaligon spent his afternoons in his garden. He was a man of no title and no rank, but every year on the anniversary of the midnight pour, a bottle of fine Scotch would arrive on his doorstep with no return address. He would pour 2 glasses, one for himself and one for the foreman he had never met, but whose hands had held the world together. The story of the Cobalt Shadow was a reminder that history isn't just made by kings and generals. It's made by clerks who refuse to sign, couriers who refuse to run, and foremen who refuse to let go. As the sun set over the English Channel, the shadows were long, but they were no longer dark. The accounts were closed, the secrets were out, and for the first time in a generation, the air felt clean.